The insurance company refused his flooded farm. He rebuilt it, bigger than before. The water came in August of 1993, and it didn't leave for 11 days. Mercer County, Missouri. The farm sat low on the East Fork of the Thompson River, 7 miles north of Princeton, on 140 acres that Calvin Pruitt's father had broken sod on in 1947. Calvin was 58 that summer, had been working that same ground for 31 years. The corn was 8 feet tall when the levee upstream gave way on August 11th. By the following morning, 4 feet of river water covered the bottomland fields. The barn took on 18 inches inside. The equipment shed flooded to the doorframe. Calvin stood on the porch and watched it come. He didn't say anything, just watched. By August 14th, the water had reached the foundation of the house. He moved what he could: the furniture, the records, the seed catalogs going back to 1967. His wife Ruth carried boxes while he loaded the John Deere 4640 onto a borrowed flatbed and drove it to higher ground 3 miles east. The tractor made it. The 1978 International Disc Harrow did not. It was still in the shed when the water crested. The flood held for 11 days. When it receded, it left behind 2 inches of silt over everything. The corn was gone. The soybeans were gone. The alfalfa the Pruitts had seeded the previous spring, 37 acres of it, was gone. The topsoil in the lowest fields had sheeted off in the current and deposited itself somewhere downstream. Calvin walked the property on August 22nd, pushed the toe of his boot into the riverbed sediment, covering what had been his best ground. It went in 4 inches before hitting anything solid. He went inside and called his insurance agent. His agent's name was Dennis Hargrove. Had worked for Midland Agricultural Assurance out of Chillicothe for 19 years. Calvin had been a policyholder for all of them. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Hargrove told him the policy covered structural damage and equipment loss. Told him the 1978 Disc Harrow would be assessed. Told him crop loss was covered up to 60% of the documented yield average from the previous 3 years. Then Hargrove told him the bottomland fields were not covered. Calvin asked him to repeat that. The policy excluded fields in the designated federal flood plain. Calvin's bottomland acres, 63 of them, sat inside the 100-year flood designation. Had sat there since the Army Corps of Engineers reclassified that stretch of the Thompson River in 1989. Hargrove explained this carefully, said it wasn't personal, said he was sorry, said the coverage limit for the upland acres, 77 of them, would be assessed within 30 days. Calvin thanked him and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. The table was still damp. The linoleum floor had buckled in 2 places near the refrigerator. Outside the window, the fields were the color of river clay. The sky was clear. It hadn't rained in a week. Ruth came in from the yard, saw him sitting there, didn't ask what the insurance company said. By the look on his face, she already knew most of it. The claims adjuster arrived on September 3rd. His name was Tim Bowles. He drove a white company truck up the gravel lane, walked the upland fields with a clipboard, measured the equipment shed damage, photographed the foundation crack on the north wall of the barn, spent 4 hours on the property, left without going near the bottomland fields, said those weren't in scope. The final settlement offer came by mail on September 28th, $3,400, covering the Disc Harrow replacement at $8,200 market value, the shed repair at $4,600, crop loss on the 77 upland acres at $18,600, based on a 60% payout against a 3-year yield average. The letter was 3 pages long, signed by a regional claims director Calvin had never met. Calvin read the letter twice, put it in the kitchen drawer. The 63 bottomland acres were not mentioned anywhere in the document. Not in the loss schedule, not in the exclusion language. Just absent, as if they didn't exist, as if 11 days of river water hadn't stripped the topsoil off the ground his father had built from nothing. He drove to the county extension office in Princeton the following week. Talked to the extension agent there, a man named Ray Dunbar, who had been in that office since 1981. Calvin explained the situation, the floodplain exclusion, the 63 acres, the silt deposit, the topsoil loss. Ray listened without interrupting. Then he said what Calvin already suspected. The bottomland, under federal floodplain designation, would likely never be insurable at a cost that made farming it worthwhile. Said the Corps reclassification in 1989 had done the same thing to a dozen farms along the Thompson. Said most of those families had sold. Calvin asked what they'd done with the land. Ray said most of it had gone to timber or gone fallow. Calvin thanked him and drove home. He walked the bottomland the next morning, 63 acres of it. The silt was drying now, cracking in the September heat into plates the size of dinner trays. He pulled one up. Underneath, the old topsoil was there, dark and still moist, compacted but present. He checked 3 more spots. Same finding. The silt had covered the ground, but it hadn't taken everything. He kept walking. The river bend at the south end of the property had deposited the heaviest silt load, 8 inches deep in places. But it had also dropped something else. Organic debris from upstream, decomposed plant matter, the kind of material that cost money to buy and spread. The flood had done it for free. Calvin stopped at the south end and stood there for a long time. He didn't say anything about what he was thinking when he got back to the house. Not to Ruth, not to his neighbor Glenn Schaefer, who came by that afternoon to check on the property. Not to anyone. He drove to the library in Princeton the following Saturday and asked the librarian for anything they had on alluvial soil deposition. She found him 3 extension bulletins from the University of Missouri and a soil science textbook from 1978. He sat at the reading table for 4 hours, read all of it, took notes in a pocket notebook he carried in his shirt pocket. What he read confirmed what he'd seen on his morning walks. Flood silt deposited in river bends carried a mineral load: phosphorus, potassium, trace iron. The organic debris mixed into it broke down in the first growing season into bioavailable nitrogen. The same process that had built the fertile river deltas of the Mississippi Valley. It was slow, not immediate. The silt needed time to integrate with the existing topsoil beneath it. But in the right conditions, with the right tillage approach, bottom ground that had flooded could emerge more productive than it had been before. The University Bulletin said this plainly. Calvin read the relevant passage 3 times. He drove home and parked the truck in the equipment shed. Stood in the shed doorway looking at the 4640 tractor he'd hauled to higher ground. Ran the numbers in his head. The insurance settlement was $30,400. The disc harrow replacement would cost $8,200. The shed repair another $4,600. That left $18,600. Not enough to replant 77 upland acres and cover next year's operating costs. Not by a significant margin. The local PCA had extended a crop input loan for the following spring, but the interest on that against uncertain yields made the math uncomfortable. The 63 bottomland acres were sitting there at no cost, already owned, no rent, no purchase. Just 63 acres the insurance company had written off, and an extension agent had suggested going fallow. Calvin thought about the soil science bulletins. Thought about the organic material the river had dumped in his south field. Thought about what it would cost to do nothing with that ground versus what it might produce if handled correctly. He had a conversation with Ruth that evening. The kitchen table again. He laid out what he'd read, what he'd seen, what the numbers looked like. Ruth asked 2 questions. She asked how long it would take. He said 3 years minimum before the bottomland performed at previous levels. She asked what happened if he was wrong. He said they'd lose less than if they sold. She nodded. Didn't say anything else. Calvin called Glenn Schaefer the next morning. Glenn farmed 340 acres 3 miles to the west. No bottomland, didn't flood. Calvin asked if Glenn would be willing to borrow his deep till subsoiler for a week. Glenn said yes. Asked what Calvin was planning. Calvin told him. Glenn was quiet for a moment, then said he thought it was worth trying. Said he'd heard the same thing about alluvial deposits, but never seen anyone actually work a flooded field back deliberately. Said he'd come by if Calvin needed an extra hand. The work started in October 1993. Calvin pulled the subsoiler through the bottom fields at 14-inch depth, 3 passes over each section. The goal was to fracture the compacted layer where the silt had bonded with the existing soil surface, allowing the 2 layers to begin integrating. The subsoiler ran $11 an hour in diesel and time. He worked 63 acres over 9 days. Cost for the deep till pass, $890 in fuel. Another $240 in tool wear and sharpening. He followed the subsoiling with a moldboard plow pass at 10 inches, turning the combined layer and bringing the old topsoil up through the silt. This was the critical step. The extension bulletins had been clear on this. Don't leave the layers separate. Blend them. Let the biology work between them. Calvin plowed in November, just before the ground froze. He planted a winter cover of cereal rye across all 63 acres. Rye seed at $120 per pound, 100 pounds per acre, seeded at 60 acres that first pass, came to $7,200 in seed cost. He borrowed the drill from Glenn and got it planted by November 14th. The county extension office sent Ray Dunbar out in December. Not at Calvin's request. Dunbar had driven past the bottom fields and seen the green cover coming up through the silt and stopped because he didn't believe what he was looking at. He stood at the field edge for a while, then drove up to the house and knocked. Calvin showed him the university bulletins, showed him the soil samples he'd taken in October and November, comparing the silt layer composition against his pre-flood records from 1991. Ray studied the November sample results for a long time. Said the phosphorus numbers were higher than he'd expected. Said the potassium reading was interesting. Calvin agreed that it was interesting. Ray left without saying whether he thought it would work. Just said he'd be watching. The rye cover wintered well. Calvin terminated it in late April 1994 with a single herbicide pass and worked it under with a field cultivator, adding another 3 inches of organic matter to the profile. He planted the bottomland to soybeans that spring, not corn. Corn was the higher gross crop, but it was also the higher input crop, and Calvin didn't want to push the recovering ground. Soybeans were less demanding, a better test of what the soil could actually do. He planted 63 acres of Pioneer brand 93B15 variety on May 6th and 7th, 1994. The soybeans came up clean, even across the field. No gapping in the stands, no visible variation between the areas that had taken the heaviest silt load and the areas where coverage had been lighter. The plants were uniform. Calvin walked the rows in late June and found himself checking the same rows twice because he didn't trust what he was seeing. Glenn Schaefer came by in July, walked the bottom fields with Calvin. Didn't say much, just walked. At the end of the row, Glenn said it looked like good beans. Calvin said it looked that way to him too. Harvest came in the first week of October 1994. Calvin ran the 4640 with the combine header across the bottomland on October 4th through 6th. 3 days, 63 acres. The yield monitor read 52 bushels per acre. His pre-flood average on that same ground had been 44 bushels per acre. 3-year average, 1990 through 1992. The best year in that period had been 48. 52 bushels per acre. First year back from flood. He sat in the combine cab for a moment after finishing the last field. The river was visible to the south through the tree line. Still moving. The same river that had covered everything in August 1993. Calvin ran the combine back to the shed and cleaned it out. He called Glenn that evening, told him the yield number. Glenn was quiet for a moment, then said that was a hell of a thing. Calvin agreed that it was. He planted the bottomland to corn in 1995. Seed was DeKalb 46-26, planted May 3rd through 5th. Mid-June, Calvin walked the stand and counted 32,400 plants per acre across the field. That was right where he wanted it. Corn harvest came in September 1995. Yield 168 bushels per acre. His 1988 through 1992 corn average on that same ground had been 139 bushels per acre. Best year in that period, 151. 168 was 17 bushels above his own record on that field. Ray Dunbar came by the following week. Calvin had called him this time, showed him the yield records. The 1994 soybeans at 52, the 1995 corn at 168. Showed him the soil test results from October 1995, comparing against the pre-flood baseline. The potassium had settled back to normal range. The phosphorus was still elevated but trending down. The organic matter percentage was 3.9, up from 3.1 in the 1991 baseline test. Ray looked at the numbers for a long time. He asked if Calvin had published any of this. Calvin said no. Ray said someone should. Said the university extension system needed to know that deliberate alluvial recovery was a practical, not theoretical. That a working farmer in Mercer County had done it with a borrowed subsoiler and a bag of rye seed. Calvin said he wasn't interested in publishing anything. Said he was interested in farming the ground. Ray said he understood that. Said he'd mention it at the Regional Extension Conference in the spring, if Calvin didn't object. Calvin said he didn't object. The Midland Agricultural Assurance representative called in the fall of 1995. Not Dennis Hargrove, a different man. Name was Phil Gentry, Regional Accounts Manager. He had heard from someone at the Mercer County Farm Bureau that one of their policyholders had done something unusual with flood-damaged ground. Said he wanted to understand what Calvin had done. Calvin told him all of it. The subsoiler passes, the rye cover, the soybean year, the corn yields, the soil test comparisons. Gentry listened without interrupting. Then he asked if Calvin would be interested in having a Midland agronomist walk the property. Said the company had flagged several other floodplain parcels across northwest Missouri with similar post-flood profiles. Said if the recovery method was repeatable, they'd want to document it. Calvin said that was fine with him. He did not mention the September 1993 settlement letter. Did not mention the 3 pages that had excluded his 63 bottomland acres as if they didn't exist. Gentry didn't mention it either. The Midland agronomist came in March 1996. His name was Larry Westhoff, out of Kansas City. He walked every acre of the bottomland with Calvin. Took soil cores at 16 locations, asked detailed questions about the subsoiling depth, the cover crop termination timing, the planting populations, wrote everything in a legal pad, spent 6 hours on the property. Before he left, Westhoff said something Calvin didn't expect. He said the soil core results from the flood silt integration zone were showing a profile he'd only seen described in literature. Said the organic matter layering was textbook, but he'd never seen it in a working farm context. Said what Calvin had done was technically sound in every respect. Calvin thanked him. Said he'd just read what the university bulletin said and tried to follow it. Westhoff said most people didn't read the bulletins. Calvin planted the bottomland to soybeans again in 1996, 54 bushels per acre. Then corn in 1997, 171 bushels per acre, new personal record. Then soybeans in 1998, 57 bushels per acre, third consecutive year above his pre-flood average. The upland acres, the 77 that the insurance company had settled on, averaged 142 bushels per acre on corn years during that same period. The 63 acres that had been excluded from coverage, the ground that Dennis Hargrove had not mentioned in the settlement letter, was now producing 18% above the insured ground. In 1999, Calvin purchased an additional 40 acres of bottomland 1 mile north. It had flooded in 1993 as well. The previous owner had let it go fallow after the flood. Asking price was $780 per acre, below county average for comparable ground. Calvin paid $31,200. Cash, what the insurance settlement had paid him 6 years earlier. He worked the new parcel through the same recovery process. One subsoiler pass in the fall of 1999, rye cover that winter, soybeans in 2000, 49 bushels per acre, first year on ground that had sat untouched since the flood. Corn in 2001, 158 bushels per acre. By 2003, Calvin Pruitt was farming 280 acres, up from the 140 he'd started with. The bottomland now totaled 103 acres of his operation. The ground the insurance company had written off was the most productive portion of his farm. Glenn Schaefer came by the following spring. Walked the south fields with Calvin the way he had in the summer of 1994. The river was low that year, no concern of flooding. The corn was knee-high and even. Glenn asked Calvin if he'd ever heard back from the insurance company. Calvin said Phil Gentry had sent a letter in 1997, thanking him for participating in the agronomist visit. Said Midland had used the Pruitt documentation in a revised underwriting framework for post-flood bottomland. Said the company was now offering coverage on recovered floodplain acres in situations where documented soil restoration had occurred. Calvin had read the letter once and put it in the kitchen drawer with the 1993 settlement. Glenn said that was something. Calvin said it was. Ruth passed away in 2007. Calvin farmed alone for 2 seasons. In 2009, his son Thomas came back from Iowa to help run the operation. Thomas had studied agronomy at Iowa State, graduated in 2001, spent 8 years at a seed company. He came home and took over the input purchasing and record keeping while Calvin ran the equipment. Thomas asked about the bottomland the first fall he was back. He'd seen the yield records going back to 1994. Wanted to understand what had been done in 1993. Calvin told him. Same story he'd told Glenn. Same story he'd told the Midland agronomist and the extension office and Phil Gentry. Thomas listened to all of it, then asked one question. He asked why Calvin had decided to work the flooded ground instead of letting it go fallow like the extension agent had suggested. Calvin thought about that for a moment. He said he'd read that the same river deposits that flood your fields also built the most productive farmland in the world. Said he figured the river hadn't taken anything from him, that it hadn't also given something back. Said he wanted to find out what. Calvin Pruitt retired from day-to-day farming in 2011. He was 76. Thomas took over the full operation. The farm was 280 acres. The same as it had been since 1999. The bottomland fields still produce above the county average. Thomas had them soil tested in 2019, 26 years after the flood. The organic matter percentage in the original 63-acre parcel, 4.4, up from the 3.9 reading in 1995, up from the 3.1 baseline in 1991. The ground keeps improving, every year a little more. Calvin drove out to the south field in the spring of 2014, walked to the spot at the river bend where the silt had been 8 inches deep in September 1993. The river was low that year, just moving quietly between the banks. He stood there for a while. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The river was still there. The farm was still there. Bigger than before.